Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and what I want to talk about today is taxes, and just kind of go into the wonkery of taxes, all the little details of the tax conversation, so that way you can follow when people talk tax policy. Now, there's a separate discussion of whether there should or shouldn't be taxes. I'm not going to address that conversation here, because at the end of the day, we're going to have an income tax code at the federal and state level, or at least in most states, for years to come. So it still is important to be able to participate in that conversation, understand that conversation. So when you think of the income tax, the way the income tax is generally done at the federal and state level is typically through what's called a progressive income tax, which just means that as you make more money, your additional dollar gets taxed at a higher rate at certain points. So for example, the lowest tax rate is 15%. So the first so many dollars you make is always taxed at 15%, no matter if you're a billionaire or someone who makes $1 a year. But once you go over $400,000 a year, you hit the top tax rate, which is 39.6%. So every dollar after that gets taxed at pretty much 40%. So the idea is the only people who are paying that 39.6% are wealthier people. That's why it's considered progressive. A progressive tax is any tax that sort of shifts the tax burden more to wealthy people, and a regressive tax is any tax that shifts the burden more to less wealthy, lower income people. This would be anything where you pay a fixed dollar amount, like sales taxes, excise taxes, aka sin taxes. Because if I pay $10 and Warren Buffett pays $10 of taxes, $10 is a much bigger portion of my income than Warren Buffett. So that's why those are considered regressive taxes. Okay, cool. So what happens though is oftentimes when the current tax code is very complicated, and that complexity has lots of costs because you have to spend more money on accountants to help do your taxes. You have to spend more money on lawyers to help make sure that everything's above board. So there's a cost in preparing your taxes on top of the cost of your actual taxes. Okay, there's also a cost of time, and there's also an effect on incentives, not just the financial incentives, but also when something gets complicated and hard to do, you just less want to do it. So basically, if starting a business tax-wise, accounting and legally becomes more and more complicated to do, not necessarily more expensive, but just more hard to do, you're going to do less of it. So that has an effect on the economy. People on the margins, and when I say on the margins, what I mean is the people who are sort of on the fence. Okay, so people who are, maybe I'll start a business, maybe I won't start a business. Those people are more likely to be pushed on that side of the fence, that they're not going to start a business. You'll have people who are for sure going to start a business, and you'll have people for sure who aren't. But all these incentive effects always affect the people on the margins who are on the fence. Okay, so basically the complexity of the tax code affects that. So that's one of the big reasons for tax reform, and I think most people agree that you need to simplify the tax code, and that would have benefits as far as making more people willing to invest, willing to start businesses, because it'll make it less complicated to do so. Where generally the disagreement is on the financial benefit of those reforms. Okay, so if you were to, let's say we cut everyone's taxes by 1%, that means someone who makes $100 would save $1 in taxes, and someone who makes $1,000 would save $10 in taxes. So that's an $11 overall tax cut. Okay, let's just pretend it's two people, the $1,000 person, $100 person. Okay, you've just saved $11. That lower income person, who still saved 1% of their income, like the larger income person did, only makes up $1 of that savings. So basically, essentially, the $10 makes up over 90% of the $11. So you can argue that the higher income person made 90% of the benefit. And that's the argument that the left always makes when you propose tax cuts. So even if you made them perfectly proportionate as far as the tax savings, what's going to happen is that the wealthier are still going to benefit around 90% just because of math. But does that mean you can't design a tax cut that kind of tries to work around those politics? Not necessarily. There are ways, and I'm going to discuss some of the ideas in that regard. But let's discuss the other benefits, the economic, financial benefits of cutting taxes. Depending whose taxes you cut, there's all sorts of benefits. There's no one where there's no benefit to cutting your taxes. When you cut the taxes of wealthier people, okay, that's when you lower that top rate. Basically, rich people are less likely to go out and spend more. They probably already have more money than they're spending in the year. So they're not necessarily going to consume with the money. More than likely, it's going to sit in their savings. But savings is where all capital comes from. Okay, for example, for someone to buy stocks, that means they have to choose not to consume with that money, meaning not to buy a burger, not to buy a sweater, not to buy something for fun. Okay, to buy a bond, lend someone money, you got to choose not to use the money now. So when you save money in the bank, you're saying, I'm not going to use this money now, and the bank goes and lends it out in all sorts of different mechanisms. Okay, now some of those mechanisms are a lot more complicated. So when you think of things like asset-backed securities and the money market, but at the end of the day, it still gets lent out to someone, whether it's a small business loan, whether it's a mortgage, etc. So that money still gets in the hands of someone who puts it to use. So the more money that they save, so again, you cut taxes of the wealthy, that increases the amount of capital that's available for these kind of investments, small business, mortgage, etc. Okay, now at the lower income level, oftentimes the left focuses on that they would consume more. Yes, they would spend more in a sense, or they would at least, maybe their life will be a little bit less stressful, but that's not the real benefit of cutting taxes on the lower income people. What happens is that right now, with our regulatory and tax structure, we've made the cost of living to the point where people struggle and are sort of in a rush to get that next dollar to make the struggle a little bit less painful. So what happens is that people will work an extra 5-10 hours, work 60-70 hour weeks to get enough income so life is not, a struggle. If you cut taxes enough that, to make the same amount of income I was making at 70 hours of work and do that with 60 hours of work, well, then what happens? I don't have to work those extra 10 hours. Doesn't mean that business doesn't necessarily need to hire someone for those 10 hours, but now someone else can work those 10 hours. So then the income that that business was paying to its employees can be spread out across more people than it was before, because you don't have people competing for every hour of labor as feverishly as you did when you had a higher tax rate on the middle and lower classes. Okay, so that's what we refer to as a disincentive effect. The idea is that since you're making more money, you're keeping more money, you have less of an incentive to make that additional dollar because you have more dollars already. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, there's only a scarce, even demand for labor is a scarce thing. So if you're looking for work, having people competing over all those hours is not necessarily, less people competing over all those hours is not a bad thing. When you raise taxes, you actually have the opposite. You push people to work more, which means there's less work for people to do. And which is fine if it's easier for people to start a business to create their own work, but problem is if you increase the regulatory and tax structure, you make it harder to start your own business. So then it's harder to create your own job when there isn't enough jobs available. So you have the worst of all worlds with the current system. This is essentially what the left always wants when they propose things like the universal basic income, Social Security. They think of these as programs that sort of help people choose not to be part of the workforce for that same reason, because then there'll be more work available. The problem is that why do it that way when you can just allow people to keep their stuff and have the same effect? So why take their stuff and then basically take $1 and give back 80 cents because you lose money through administrative costs, bureaucracy, to have that effect when you can just let them keep $1 and have that effect by just letting them honoring their property rights. So that's my thing there. Okay, now when it comes to creating that tax code, there's a lot of different mechanisms in the tax code. There's the individual rates. So again, it's not just what the rates are, but at what income those rates kick in. There are tax deductions. A tax deduction is something that allows you to reduce the amount of income that's taxable. Now, once you figure out how much taxable income you have, you multiply it by your tax rate, and you get your tax liability. A tax credit would reduce your tax liability. So a tax credit often has a bigger effect on your tax bill than a tax deduction. So let's pretend we had a 40% flat tax rate. $1 deduction would save you 40 cents. $1 credit would save you $1. It's just to illustrate that concept. So there's a lot of different ideas I've had over the years as far as how you can make a simpler tax code that cuts taxes, but at the same way sort of can be marketed towards a more progressive crowd that is focusing more on sort of middle, lower class assistance. Now, one of the ideas I had when I was running for Senate was the 20% flat tax with an age-based tax credit, which if you just look up Alex Merced 20% flat tax plan, you can find that. But it does have some complexities. So a simpler version of that is still a 20% flat tax, which that's a lot lower than the top tax rate of 40%. So you'd be cutting that top tax rate in half in a sense. But it's a flat tax percent, so it doesn't matter what dollar you make, it's 20%. but you have a $5,000 tax credit. So that creates a sort of progressive scale, because let's say you make $25,000, 20% of 25 is 5,000, minus your $5,000 tax credit, you paid no taxes. You make $50,000, 20% would be $10,000, and minus your $5,000 tax credit, you paid $5,000 in taxes, that's 10%. You make 100 grand, that's 20 grand, minus 5, so that'd be a 15 grand tax bill, which is 15%. So you really wouldn't be paying, so for the first 100 grand you make, you're not paying more than 15% of your income. So that's a pretty decent tax cut for, I would say, 90% of people. It will be a tax increase on certain high income earners who benefited a lot from the previous tax code that favored their particular business, but that tax code only is because you took out the rent seeking out of the tax code. For most rich people, it'll still be a tax cut, okay? It'll only be a tax increase for those who really benefited from the rent seeking built into the tax code. Do I really want to increase taxes on anyone? Not necessarily. I want taxes to be as low as possible for as many people as possible. But at the end of the day, there's two halves of that story. It's not just about tax code, but I mean, if you can create a tax code that's simpler, that gets rid of the disincentives to start businesses, to invest, and you can get an economy growing at a better rate because you have a simpler tax code, because people can do more things because they're more comfortable doing more things, that can create the economic foundation for more deeper reforms. So hopefully you learned a lot in this video. There's so many different types of taxes. You can refer to my Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz tax video if you want to hear me talk about the estate tax and some other things. And I have plenty of tax videos I've done over the years if you just look up Alex Merced and taxes. So have a great day and enjoy. Thank you.